The sky over Bremen was supposed to be a routine milk run. That's what they told themselves every time. Routine, manageable, survivable. But Staff Sergeant James "Jimmy" Corbett knew better. He'd flown 32 bombing runs over German territory, and routine was a lie pilots told themselves so they could sleep at night. His hands were already shaking as he climbed into the upper turret of the B-17 flying fortress, his fingers numb despite the electric heating element woven into his suit. The temperature at 28,000 feet didn't just freeze you. It crept into your bones and settled there like a permanent guest, a constant reminder that this altitude was designed for machines, not men. It was November 1943, and the air war over Europe had turned into something nightmarish, a grinding, relentless attrition machine that ate aircraft and crews for breakfast. The Germans had learned to wait for the bombers at altitude, where the thin air made every maneuver feel like moving through gelatin. They'd learned that the B-17s, despite their reputation for toughness, were vulnerable if you hit them from above and behind, and they'd gotten damn good at hitting them. Jimmy's fingers trembled as he loaded the first belt of ammunition into his 50 caliber machine gun. Standard load, 5,000 rounds for the entire mission. 5,000 rounds to defend a flying fortress carrying 9 other men, and 2,000 pounds of explosives destined for German factories. The math didn't favor them. It never had. A single German Bf-109 could make 3 or 4 passes through a bomber formation before running low on fuel. Those passes could mean the difference between heading home and spiraling down in flames. The first engine fired, then the second, third, and fourth. The B-17 trembled and shuddered as all 4 Pratt & Whitney engines came to life, the fuselage groaning like some great metal beast waking from an uneasy sleep. Jimmy secured his position, running through the checklist he'd memorized months ago, charging handles, ammunition belts, elevation controls, traverse controls. Every movement was precise, mechanical. Muscle memory kept you alive up there. But something was wrong this morning. Something felt different. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Jimmy noticed the ordnance crews loading ammunition canisters into the fuselage with unusual urgency. They were talking about something. He could see their mouths moving through the turret window, even if he couldn't hear them over the engine noise. One of them, a corporal with a scarred face, was gesturing emphatically at the ammunition racks. The officer nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again. If you're new here and love untold war stories, hit that subscribe button and like this video. We're uncovering the wildest moments from aviation history that you've probably never heard of. The formation climbed steadily, and Jimmy watched the clouds fall away beneath them. 47 bombers, each one carrying a 10-man crew, all of them hoping they'd draw the short straw and get a quiet run. The odds suggested at least 3 of these aircraft wouldn't be coming back. Maybe more. Maybe all of them. The German fighters had been particularly aggressive lately, sensing weakness in the daylight bombing campaigns. High altitude, long distances, no fighter escort beyond a certain point. It was a hunting ground, and the Luftwaffe knew it. That's when Jimmy heard Lieutenant Colonel Harmon's voice crackle through the intercom. Bandit call, 3 o'clock high. Range, looks like 2,000 yards. Everybody stay sharp. The tension in the fuselage crystallized immediately. This was it. The moment that would separate the living from the dead, though neither group would fully understand their fortune until later. But something else was different about this run, and Jimmy was about to discover exactly what. In his desperation for a solution to an impossible problem, a 26-year-old armorer named Private Eddie Kaufman had done something that technically violated every regulation in the Army Air Force's manual. He'd modified the ammunition feed system on Jimmy's turret in a way that nobody had ever attempted before. A small, ingenious modification that defied every reasonable standard of engineering practice. It was stupid. It was reckless. It shouldn't have worked. But today, flying into the teeth of 5 squadrons of German fighters, that stupid idea was about to change the trajectory of an entire air battle. The first contrails appeared in the distance, the telltale streamers that meant German fighters were climbing to meet them. Jimmy's stomach dropped. His breathing accelerated, fogging the small window of the turret. His hands gripped the weapon handles so tightly his knuckles turned white. The turret whined as he traversed it toward the emerging threat, the hydraulic motors responding to his slightest movement. 4 50 caliber machine guns, 940 rounds per minute per gun when everything worked perfectly. Except today, nothing was working to specification, and he didn't even know it yet. The radio crackled again. Different voice now, one of the waist gunners. Bandits at 6 o'clock, climbing fast. Count, I make it 15, maybe 18. The formation tightened. Pilots would be watching for the signal to execute evasive maneuvers. The bombardier in the nose would be calculating vectors, distances, the precise moment when the flak guns below would need to be avoided. Everyone was thinking about survival, about making it back to England, about letters waiting at home. Nobody was thinking about the fact that Jimmy Corbett's ammunition feed system had just been fundamentally altered in a way that would make him either the luckiest gunner in the 8th Air Force or the architect of his own spectacular destruction. The first burst of cannon fire arrived like divine punctuation. Rounds punched through the fuselage, and the whole aircraft shuddered. Someone screamed on the intercom, but not with pain, with anger. The pilot's voice cut through everything. Evading hard left. All gunners commence firing, fight like hell. This was the moment where training ended and survival instinct took over. Jimmy's fingers found the trigger, and the guns began to roar. The first burst from Jimmy's turret gun caught the lead Bf-109 completely by surprise. The German pilot, confident in his superior climbing rate, hadn't expected the B-17's top turret to track him so quickly. Rounds walked across the fighter's wing, not a direct hit, but close enough. Close enough to make him break off and start a banking turn that would take him out of immediate firing position. But there were 14 more fighters climbing toward the bomber stream, and the real nightmare was just beginning. Jimmy's hands had moved into that strange zone where everything slowed down and accelerated simultaneously. Time became elastic in combat. 10 seconds felt like an hour felt like 10 seconds. He could feel the turret responding to his touch, the guns pivoting and elevating with mechanical precision. The .50 caliber rounds were tearing through the thin air at 28,000 feet, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Each tracer round burned red in the darkness between the clouds, creating a visual trail that told him whether his aim was true. But something was happening that made no sense. His ammunition feed wasn't stuttering. Every time he squeezed the trigger, the rounds poured out continuously, one after another, without the jams and feed problems that plagued every other turret gunner in the formation. Most gunners experienced at least one major jam per combat mission. It was just part of the mathematics of operating complex machinery at altitude. Frozen ammunition, bent rounds, feed mechanism failures. But Jimmy's guns were running smooth, impossibly smooth. Below the fuselage in the waist section, gunner Raymond Ray Mitchell was having a very different experience. His starboard gun jammed after 300 rounds. He cleared it, got 10 more rounds off, and it jammed again. This was normal. This was war. He worked the clearing handle frantically, trying to get rounds down range as another Bf-109 made a pass at the formation. 2 seconds. That's all the time he had. 2 seconds before the fighter rolled away, its ammunition exhausted, or its pilot deciding that this particular bomber wasn't worth the risk. But up in the turret, Jimmy was experiencing something unprecedented. One of the Bf-109s was diving at his bomber from directly above, a move designed to use the fighter's superior energy to tear through the fuselage with cannon fire. Most gunners would have been dead before they could get the guns trained on the fighter. But Jimmy was already tracking upward, his guns already hot, already firing. The first burst went wide, the second caught the wing, the third caught the fuselage, and the Bf-109 suddenly rolled hard to the left, smoke trailing from its engine cowling. The pilot was good though, really good. He managed to get the fighter stabilized and started another attack pattern, but now he was damaged, bleeding fuel or oil, his aircraft's performance degrading by the second. He'd have to break off eventually, either get back to his base in Germany or punch out and hope he landed somewhere. He wouldn't be captured. The problem was, there were 4 more fighters diving into the formation, and Jimmy was about to run into a problem that no amount of mechanical modification could solve. The B-17 shuddered again, this time from cannon fire that caught the right wing. Someone screamed a genuine scream this time. Pain, terror, the sound of someone experiencing trauma beyond what their mind could process. The pilot's voice cut through the chaos. "Ball turret, we've got fire in the wing. Get it, or we're done." The ball turret gunner, tucked underneath the fuselage in a transparent bubble, was already responding. His guns roared to life, tracers reaching out toward the fighter making the attack. Jimmy pivoted his guns, trying to track a second fighter that was making an aggressive climb toward the rear of the bomber formation. This one was different. The pilot was taking an unusual angle, clearly experienced in finding the blind spots in the bomber's defensive fire. Jimmy had maybe 4 seconds to get rounds on this target before the fighter would be in a position to deliver a cannon burst directly into the tail. He fired. The gun barked beneath his gloved hands, and he watched the tracers climb toward the fighter. But something was wrong with his aim. The rounds were going wide, high. The fighter was already rolling into its attack, and Jimmy knew, with that strange clarity that combat bestows, that he was about to see his entire aircraft torn apart. Except it didn't happen, because in that precise moment, the modification that Eddie Kaufman had made to the ammunition feed system revealed its purpose. Kaufman had been working on a theory, one that every other armorer had dismissed as impossible. What if you could increase the linking efficiency of the ammunition belts? What if you could reduce the gap between rounds by nearly half? What if a 50 caliber gun could fire not at 940 rounds per minute, but at something closer to 1400? The modification was crude. It was dangerous. The gun had never been stress tested at that rate, but it was working. It was working magnificently. Jimmy's rounds suddenly seemed to be everywhere the BF-109 was, everywhere it might be, everywhere it could possibly be. The tracer stream was so dense that it looked like a solid rod of fire reaching out across the sky. The German pilot, expecting the normal rate of fire, hadn't calculated for this volume of ammunition. He tried to brake hard to the right, but he was already committed to his firing pass. His canopy exploded from hits, and suddenly the fighter was no longer diving. It was cartwheeling through the sky, completely out of control. The pilot managed to eject, and his parachute bloomed above the formation as his fighter spiraled down toward the earth below, wreathed in smoke and flame. Jimmy's hands were shaking violently now, but not from fear, from exhilaration, from the sudden, intoxicating realization that he had just accomplished something extraordinary. But he didn't have time to process it, because 2 more fighters were diving into the formation, and now they had to deal with a gunner who was rapidly becoming convinced that he was invulnerable. The pilot's voice crackled. "Jimmy, where the hell did that fighter come from? Good shooting, but we've got more incoming. This whole German Air Force is up here." Jimmy didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was already tracking the next threat. His guns already spinning up to temperature, his hands already positioned on the triggers. But now he was about to discover the true cost of Eddie Kaufman's modification. The gun wasn't just firing faster, it was burning hotter. Operating far beyond its design specifications, the barrel was heating to temperatures it had never been intended to reach. At this altitude, with this rate of fire sustained for more than a few minutes, something was going to break. The question was whether it would happen before he could save his entire bomber crew from annihilation. The second wave of German fighters came in coordinated pairs, a tactic designed to overwhelm the bomber's defensive fire by attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. The pilot in the right-hand fighter was a major with over 200 combat hours. He'd seen countless B-17s go down in flames. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, exactly how to position an attack run to minimize exposure to defensive fire. He'd survived this long because he was methodical, intelligent, and utterly devoid of mercy. His wingman was younger, maybe 22, maybe 23. This was his 14th mission. He'd never shot down a bomber before, but he'd seen others do it, and he was confident in his superior aircraft. A BF-109 with 200 horsepower, more than a B-17's engines could muster. Better climb rate, better turning radius. The B-17 was armored, heavily armed, built to take punishment, but it was also built to absorb punishment, not to dance. And in air combat, the ability to dance was everything. The major came in from 11 o'clock, slightly above the bomber's nose. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. Get rounds into the cockpit, force the pilot to break formation or die, and then his wingman would finish the job. He'd executed this maneuver successfully 43 times. This would be number 44. Jimmy saw them coming and knew immediately that these were different from the previous fighters. These pilots were flying with purpose, with coordination, with the kind of professional menace that separated experienced predators from inexperienced prey. He pivoted the turret and started tracking the major's approach. The distance closed. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. He fired, and suddenly the sky between the B-17 and the German fighters erupted into a curtain of 50 caliber fire. The gun was roaring now, burning through ammunition at a rate that was frankly obscene. Jimmy could feel the heat radiating up through the gun mounts. Even at 28,000 feet, the barrel was building up an ominous warmth, but the results were undeniable. The Major's fighter took hits across the wings and fuselage, not fatal hits, not immediately anyway, but enough to make him abandon his firing pass and break hard left. His wingman, seeing the older pilot break off, made the rookie mistake of pressing the attack. He came in hard and fast, banking the Bf-109 to bring his cannon to bear on the bomber's fuselage. Jimmy was already tracking him, already firing, already creating a storm of rounds that the young German had absolutely no chance of flying through without taking damage. The fighter took hits in the engine. Smoke poured from the cowling. The pilot tried to limp away, but it was clear he was going to have to punch out before the engine seized completely. Jimmy watched him abandon the aircraft, watched the parachute deploy, watched the Bf-109 fall from the sky trailing smoke and flame. But there was no time to celebrate, because now 6 more fighters were climbing into attacking position, and Jimmy's ammunition supply was starting to become a genuine concern. The problem with the modification that Eddie Kaufman had created was that it had been designed with pure functionality in mind. Nobody had stopped to calculate the actual heat load that the gun would experience under sustained firing. Nobody had done the thermodynamic calculations necessary to determine how long a .50 caliber barrel could operate at this firing rate before it reached critical temperature and started to warp. Nobody had tested it because it was, fundamentally, a stupid idea that had never been expected to work in the first place, but it was working. And the cost of that success was becoming apparent in the form of thermal stress that nothing in the gun's construction had prepared it for. Ray Mitchell, in the waist section, was watching the tail gunner perform miracles through the window. 4 fighters downed in less than 5 minutes. It was impossible. B-17s didn't shoot down fighters. Fighters shot down B-17s. That was the fundamental mathematics of air combat. Yet somehow, the top turret gunner was rewriting those equations in real time. "Control, this is Tail," came the voice of the tail gunner, Technical Sergeant Donald "Donnie" Hughes. "I count at least 25 German fighters in the area, more climbing from below. This is turning into a full-scale engagement." The pilot's response was grim. "All gunners, prepare for maximum defense. We're going to fight our way through this. No formation breaks. Stay together." That was suicide. Everyone on the bomber knew it. Staying in formation when you were under attack by 25 fighters meant that someone else's blood was going to decorate your windscreen, that someone else's ammunition was going to be the only thing between you and incineration. But breaking formation meant becoming a solitary target, and a solitary B-17 against even 3 Bf-109s was a losing proposition. So they stayed together, and Jimmy, in his turret, kept firing. He kept burning through ammunition at rates that were completely unsustainable. He kept tracking targets with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural, and he kept his guns hot. The 6 fighters that were climbing into attack position made their move simultaneously, a coordinated assault that had been planned by experienced pilots who understood exactly how to overwhelm a bomber's defensive capability. They came from 6 different vectors: above, below, left, right, and straight ahead. It should have been impossible to mount an effective defense against an attack from so many angles at once, but Jimmy's guns were everywhere. His tracers were reaching out across the sky like the fingers of some mechanical god, touching every approach vector, making every pilot recalculate whether this particular bombing run was worth dying for. The lead fighter took hits directly in the cockpit. The canopy shattered, and the pilot's body suddenly had several thousand holes in it. The fighter rolled and fell. The second fighter managed to get off a burst of cannon fire before Jimmy's rounds caught the engine. Shells walked across the B-17's fuselage, and someone screamed again, this time not from fear, but from pain. The radio crackled with urgency. "Ball turret is hit, I'm bleeding, I'm hit bad." But the ball turret gunner kept firing, kept returning fire, kept refusing to accept that this was the moment when his luck ran out. The third fighter broke off, smoking from multiple hits. The fourth fighter's pilot decided that the risk-reward calculation had shifted too far in the wrong direction and turned his aircraft away from the engagement. The fifth and sixth fighters were already committed to their attack runs, and by the time they realized that penetrating through Jimmy's defensive fire was going to cost them their lives, it was already too late. Both fighters took catastrophic damage and fell from the sky in successive spirals of flame and smoke. Jimmy's turret had just performed a miracle. In less than 10 minutes, a single gunner had shot down 9 German fighters, nearly 2 full squadrons. The remaining Bf-109s in the area were beginning to show signs of hesitation. The pilots were calculating losses and comparing them to potential gains, and the mathematics of attrition were starting to favor retreat. But the gun was dying. Jimmy could feel it in the resistance when he tried to traverse, in the sluggishness of the elevation controls. The barrel had reached temperatures that were starting to warp the metallic structure. The ammunition feed was beginning to show signs of stress. The receiver assembly was heating up so intensely that paint was beginning to char on its surface. And the worst part was, there were still more fighters climbing into attack position. The pilot of the lead fighter in this new group was Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a veteran with over 60 confirmed kills and the kind of combat experience that came from surviving 3 years of continuous air combat. He'd watched what was happening to the bomber formation with professional interest, calculating weaknesses, identifying opportunities. He'd also noticed that the top turret gunner, whoever he was, seemed to be performing at levels that defied normal human capability. Weber's hypothesis was that this was a mechanical problem, not a skill problem. The concentration of fire he was observing suggested an automatic system or some kind of malfunction in the firing mechanism that was creating a denser than normal stream of rounds. In Weber's experience, mechanical malfunctions tended to follow predictable patterns. They would operate perfectly for a few minutes, then fail catastrophically. So, he decided to probe the system. He would bring his fighter close, force the gunner to fire heavily, and look for the moment when the mechanical failure occurred. That moment would be his opportunity to attack. What Weber didn't account for was that he was flying directly into the last functional surge that Jimmy's gun had to give. Because Jimmy, feeling the gun degrading beneath his hands, was also calculating his options. He could feel the resistance increasing in the firing mechanism. He could sense that his weapon was approaching the moment of final failure, and so he made a conscious decision to push it even harder, to pull every last bit of performance from the system before it seized up completely. Weber's fighter took fire at 1,500 yards. The rounds were less dense than they'd been 5 minutes earlier. The firing rate was definitely beginning to degrade, but they were still accurate, still deadly, still enough to spray hits across the fighter's fuselage and left wing. Weber banked hard to the right, breaking off his attack, but he'd learned what he needed to know. The gun was faltering. The system was failing. Maybe another minute or two and it would be completely non-functional. He radioed his wingmen. "The turret is failing. Second pass will find it dead. Execute coordinated attack pattern. All vectored from above." Jimmy heard the intercom chatter that he wasn't supposed to hear. The radio operator had accidentally left an open channel to one of the German frequency bands. He understood enough German to grasp the essential meaning. They knew his gun was dying. That gave him maybe 90 seconds before the next wave of attacks arrived. 90 seconds to figure out if there was any way to prevent what was about to happen. The gun was heating up so badly now that he could see a faint shimmer of heat distortion coming from the barrel. The ammunition feed was definitely sluggish. Rounds were coming out at maybe 70% of their peak rate. The elevation mechanism was sticking. The temperature gauge for the turret had long since stopped being relevant. It maxed out at 250 degrees, and the actual temperature had to be significantly higher than that. The barrel, designed to operate at sustained temperatures around 400 degrees, had to be pushing 500 or higher by now. Jimmy knew enough about small arms mechanics to understand that he was living on borrowed time. Metal loses its integrity at these temperatures. Barrels can warp, receivers can crack, ammunition can cook off from the ambient heat alone, but his crew was counting on him. 9 men in this aircraft, 10 if you counted himself, and all of their survival depended on whether he could keep his guns functional for the next few minutes. He tried to think. Was there anything Eddie Kaufman had told him about the modification? Any instructions about maintenance, about cooling, about procedures for dealing with heat stress? But there hadn't been any instructions because Kaufman hadn't even wanted Jimmy to know that the gun had been modified. It was only when Jimmy had gotten into the turret and immediately noticed that something was different about the firing characteristics that Kaufman had reluctantly explained what he'd done. The modification had been based on tighter ammunition linking, which meant that the rounds were traveling through the feed system more quickly, which meant that the overall firing rate had increased. But Kaufman had also mentioned something else. something that had seemed trivial at the time, but suddenly seemed relevant. He'd installed a small system of improvised cooling ducts that ran along the barrel receiver, designed to pull air from the outside of the fuselage and use the natural airflow to dissipate heat. At 28,000 feet, flying at 160 miles per hour, that external airflow was cold, brutally, dangerously cold, but it was also doing its job. If the barrel hadn't had that cooling system, it would have seized up 15 minutes ago. Jimmy suddenly realized that the cooling system was the only thing keeping him in the fight, the only thing between him and complete mechanical failure, the only thing that might allow him to fire another 100 rounds, another 200 rounds, maybe another 300 if he was lucky. The formation was starting to break up. The pilot was making evasive maneuvers, trying to get distance from the main engagement area, but they were still surrounded, still trapped in the middle of a coordinated assault by German fighters, who now understood that the gunner was losing effectiveness. Donnie Hughes in the tail section was doing his best, but he could only defend the rear. Ray Mitchell in the waist was covering left and right, but his guns kept jamming, and every jam meant 30 seconds of no fire while he worked the clearing handles. The ball turret gunner was still functional, but bleeding heavily from the cannon hits that had punctured through the fuselage. Jimmy was alone with his dying gun, trying to make decisions about how to allocate the last gasps of firepower that his weapon could muster. That's when he saw them. 6 Bf-109s coming in from above and forward, using the sun at their backs to create a devastating glint that would make tracking difficult. They were executing the attack pattern that Hauptmann Weber had planned, and they were executing it with the coordination of pilots who'd practiced this maneuver countless times. The first fighter opened fire at 2,000 yards. His cannon rounds walked across the top of the bomber's fuselage, punching holes through the aluminum skin. Jimmy pivoted the turret, but his guns were already running at maybe 50% of their peak firing rate. The rounds came out in stuttering bursts rather than the continuous roar they'd produced 15 minutes earlier. But he was still hitting, still damaging. The first fighter took rounds across the wing, and the pilot broke hard, abandoning his attack. But now the second fighter was in position, and then the third, and suddenly Jimmy's gun seized. Complete mechanical failure. The bolt locked up. The firing mechanism jammed. The round that was halfway into the chamber would not advance any further. Dead. Completely dead. For the first time in the entire engagement, Jimmy's turret was silent. The silence was worse than any sound could have been. In that moment, with the gun locked up and completely non-functional, Jimmy understood what it felt like to be helpless. The third Bf-109 came in hard, its pilot confident that the turret was now dead weight. But Donnie Hughes in the tail section saw the opening and fired. His rounds caught the fighter's right wing, causing the pilot to break off his attack and bank left, away from the bomber's defensive fire. Jimmy's hands moved with desperate speed, operating on pure muscle memory and the primal need to survive. He worked the charging handle, trying to clear the jam. Nothing. The bolt wouldn't move backward. The round was stuck. Completely, utterly stuck. He tried again, pulling hard on the handle, using strength he didn't know he had. The handle moved maybe a quarter inch, then locked up completely. The fourth fighter was making its attack run now. Jimmy was out of the fight. Completely out. All he could do was watch as the cannon fire came toward his bomber, knowing that there was absolutely nothing he could do to prevent whatever was about to happen. But the ball turret gunner, the man who'd taken cannon hits and was bleeding all over the floor of his cramped bubble, opened fire first. His rounds caught the Bf-109's fuselage, and the pilot realized he was in mortal danger. He broke hard to the right, trying to get out of the ball turret's firing envelope. The rounds followed him, walking across his wing and fuselage. It wasn't a clean kill, but it was enough to make him abandon the attack and start limping away from the formation. Jimmy kept working the jam. He had to clear it, had to get the gun functional again, had to do something because the 5th and 6th fighters were making their coordinated attacks, and without his defensive fire, the bomber was going to get torn to pieces. The 5th fighter came in from above, its pilot confident in a quick kill. Ray Mitchell's gun jammed at the critical moment. The cannon fire hit the B-17's left engine, and suddenly an engine that had been purring smoothly for hours was coughing and sputtering, streaming smoke and oil. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, tight and controlled, but edged with the kind of stress that came from knowing that half your available thrust had just become unreliable. Left engine hit. Feathering now, switch to reserve fuel pump. We're losing altitude. The bomber's climb rate decreased noticeably. The whole aircraft began to drop slightly, losing the altitude advantage that was its only real protection against the German fighters below. Pilots circling at lower altitude could now begin climbing to attack from more effective angles. Jimmy's charging handle suddenly came loose. A quarter-inch of movement became a half-inch. The jam was loosening. He pulled hard, using leverage, using angle, using everything he could to force the mechanism to clear. The round that was stuck finally came free. The bolt cycled. The next round advanced into the chamber. The gun barked to life again. Weak, sluggish, barely operational, but firing. The sixth fighter was making its final attack run, confident that the turret was essentially non-functional. Jimmy's fire caught the fighter's left wing, and the pilot's concentration broke for just long enough that he didn't get his cannon rounds on target. Instead of punching into the cockpit or fuselage, his rounds hit the tail section, and suddenly Donnie Hughes was in serious trouble. The tail was damaged, severely damaged. Donnie reported over the intercom. Tail section is hit. Elevator controls are sluggish. I'm taking on damage. Can barely move the turret. The pilot's response was immediate. Can you still defend the rear? Donnie's response came back within a second. I can fire. That's all that matters. Jimmy looked at his ammunition supply. He'd started with 5,000 rounds. He'd fired roughly 4,000 of them in the last 20 minutes of continuous combat. His ammunition belts were running low. The gun was damaged, barely functional, operating at a fraction of its normal performance. And there were still at least 15 German fighters in the area, circling, regrouping, preparing for another coordinated assault. The pilot's voice came through the intercom again, and this time it was the voice of a man making a decision that he didn't want to make. All gunners, we're breaking formation. Too much damage, we're going to try to run. Maybe we can reach England without running into another fighter group. Ray Mitchell protested, Sir, we break formation. We're sitting ducks for any single fighter we encounter. The pilot's response was calm but absolute. We're already sitting ducks. Left engine is smoking. Tail is damaged. Hull is peppered with holes. We can limp home in formation, or we can break and maybe make it if we get lucky. I'm choosing luck. The bomber began to ease out of formation, dropping slightly below the main group of B-17s. The German fighters saw the movement immediately. They saw a wounded animal separated from the herd. They saw opportunity, but something was happening that Hauptmann Weber hadn't anticipated. The gunner in the top turret, despite his gun being damaged and barely functional, was still fighting, still trying, still refusing to accept defeat. Kaufman's modification, even at the edge of complete mechanical failure, was still producing results that defied normal firing characteristics. Jimmy fired at the lead fighter in the next attack pattern. His rounds were sporadic, stuttering, nothing like the dense curtain of fire he'd been producing earlier, but they were enough to make the pilot adjust his attack angle, enough to move the rounds just far enough off perfect that they passed through the bomber's fuselage instead of hitting critical systems, enough to make the German rethink whether this particular target was worth the risk. One by one, the German fighters began to break off. Not all of them, but enough. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned that this particular B-17 and this particular gunner had a way of making survival uncertain. In air combat, when survival becomes uncertain, pilots start thinking about fuel reserves, about the distance back to their airfields, about whether they have enough ammunition to finish the job, or whether they should preserve what they have for easier targets. The bomber was now alone, separated from the formation, smoking from one engine, damaged in the tail, with a hull that looked like someone had taken a Swiss cheese grater to it, but it was flying. It was still in the air, and the gunner in the top turret was still fighting, even with a gun that was barely functional. Jimmy watched the last of the fighters break off and head back toward German airspace. His entire body was shaking violently now. The adrenaline that had been carrying him through 20 minutes of continuous combat was wearing off, and the crash was starting. His vision was swimming slightly. His fingers were completely numb. The seat beneath him felt like it was tilting in a sickening way. The radio operator's voice came through the intercom. Engineering to pilot. I've been going through the ammunition supply trying to calculate how many rounds we have left. Something's wrong with the numbers. The pilot's voice came back, still controlled but showing signs of exhaustion. What do you mean something's wrong? The radio operator's response was confused. Sir, Based on the firing rate and duration, the top turret gunner should have expended more than 5,000 rounds by now, but the ammunition belts show only about 30% depletion. It's like the rounds are lasting longer than they should be. Jimmy suddenly understood. The modification that Eddie Kaufman had made hadn't just increased the firing rate, it had also somehow altered the linking system in a way that meant fewer individual rounds were required to achieve the same amount of fire. The ammunition was lasting longer than normal. The miracle wasn't just in the gun's performance, it was in the ammunition itself. But that miracle was burning itself out. The gun was running so hot that Jimmy could see actual heat shimmer coming from the barrel. The cooling system was working, but it couldn't work forever. Sooner or later the metal was going to give up. Sooner or later something was going to break. And based on the sound the gun was now making, a kind of grinding metal-on-metal resistance, sooner was probably going to be a lot sooner than Jimmy had hoped. The bomber limped eastward, toward England, toward home, toward the possibility that somehow, against all reasonable odds, this particular aircraft and this particular crew might actually survive. But the celebration was premature. The damaged left engine was heating up, and the pilot was constantly monitoring the temperature gauge, watching for signs that the engine was about to seize completely. Ray Mitchell came to the radio operator's station, where the ammunition accounting mystery was being discussed. "What do you mean the ammunition is wrong?" The radio operator, a small man named Peters, with nervous hands and cigarette burns on his uniform, showed him the ammunition belts. "Look at this, the top turret should have fired through these belts completely, but there's still rounds left in every belt, like somehow they're lasting longer." Ray understood immediately what had happened, but he didn't want to say it out loud because saying it would mean acknowledging something impossible. Whatever Eddie Kaufman had done to Jimmy's turret wasn't just about increasing firing rate. It was about creating efficiency that shouldn't exist. It was about ammunition that was lasting longer than ammunition should last, in ways that violated the basic mathematics of ballistics. In the tail section, Donnie Hughes was assessing the damage to his turret. The elevator controls were sluggish, really sluggish. Sluggish enough that he was worried the tail section might be at structural risk, but as long as he could aim the gun and fire, he could still do his job. And right now his job was staying alert in case any German fighters followed the bomber eastward. In the top turret, Jimmy was dealing with a crisis that had nothing to do with ammunition accounting and everything to do with barrel temperature. The gun had been firing for over 30 minutes straight, with only brief breaks when jamming forced him to clear the feed mechanism. At this point, the barrel had to be operating at temperatures that were approaching the limits of the cooling system's ability to manage. The shooting had slowed down, partly because there were fewer targets, partly because the gun was physically failing. But even at reduced firing rate, the heat was building up faster than it could be dissipated. Jimmy could see actual charring on the receiver assembly now. Paint was flaking off in black chips. The metal itself had taken on a dull reddish color in places, a sign that the material was beginning to undergo the first stages of metallurgical breakdown. He needed to let it cool. Badly. But every time he reduced fire, he knew there was a risk that German fighters would return, emboldened by the knowledge that the turret was failing. So he kept firing, kept pushing the system, kept driving the mechanical failure forward one squeeze of the trigger at a time. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again. "Estimating we'll reach the coast of England in about 40 minutes. Gonna be close on fuel, and we've got the left engine situation to deal with. Once we're over England, we'll try to limp back to the base." Ray Mitchell had moved back to his waist position, and he made a mental note to check on Jimmy once the adrenaline wore off. A gunner who could do what Jimmy had done in the last hour, 10 fighters shot down. That was a man who'd just lived through something that would mark him for the rest of his life. But right now, Jimmy was still in crisis mode, still operating on automatic response and muscle memory, still pushing his dying gun to function just a little bit longer. That's when the third wave of fighters arrived. Nobody expected them. The consensus had been that the German fighters in the area had decided that pursuit wasn't worth the fuel cost. But someone had radioed ahead to a German airfield that a crippled B-17 was heading toward the coast, and someone there had decided that a confirmed kill would be worth the fuel expenditure. The intercom crackled with sudden urgency. "Bandits at 3 o'clock high, count looks like 8, maybe 9. Jimmy's stomach dropped. He had maybe 200 rounds left in his ammunition belts. Maybe 300 if he pushed it. Against 8 German fighters, that was probably going to be enough for one good defensive pass. and then he'd be dry. He brought the guns to bear and started tracking the lead fighter. The gun responded sluggishly. Sluggish enough that by the time he had the trigger squeezed, the fighter was already making its attack run. Rounds fired out, sparse, slow, nothing like what they'd been earlier. The Bf-109 pilot saw the reduced effectiveness immediately and pressed his attack with confidence. The cannon fire hit the bomber's nose section, and suddenly the bombardier was screaming, a sound of genuine agony that cut through all the other noise in the cockpit. The pilot's voice came back, strained and urgent. "Bombardier is hit. Medbay, get up there. Co-pilot, take the nose gun." But taking the nose gun meant the co-pilot had to leave his position, had to trust that the pilots wouldn't need him in the next few critical minutes. Jimmy fired again, and this time his rounds caught the fighter's fuselage. Not a clean hit, not clean enough to bring the fighter down or even to drive it away, but enough to make the pilot brake hard left and avoid pressing further on his attack run. The second fighter came in from below, using the belly of the bomber as cover from the tail turret fire. Donnie Hughes couldn't get an angle. The ball turret gunner tried to track, but the sluggish elevator controls weren't responding fast enough. The cannon fire punched through the fuselage again, and suddenly the aircraft lurched violently. Hydraulic fluid began streaming from a ruptured line. The pilot's voice was tight with tension. "Hydraulic system is compromised. I'm losing pressure. Check the fluid levels and see if we can seal the leak." But there was no time for damage control. The third and fourth fighters were making coordinated attacks now. Jimmy's gun was dying. He could feel it in every fiber of the metal. The barrel was warped slightly now, just enough that the rounds were starting to go slightly wide. The receiver was so hot that he could feel the heat through his gloves, through multiple layers of insulation. The ammunition feed was barely functioning. Rounds had to be manually helped into the chamber half the time. But he kept firing, kept pushing, kept refusing to accept defeat even as the machine beneath his hands was destroying itself. One of the incoming fighters took a hit to the engine and started smoking. The pilot punched out, and his parachute deployed as the Bf-109 spiraled down toward the water below. That left 7 fighters still in the engagement, and Jimmy's ammunition was now down to maybe 100 rounds. The ball turret gunner reported, "I'm running dry too, 40 rounds left, maybe 50. Ray Mitchell in the waist, "I've got about 75. This is it. We're going to be undefended in about 2 minutes. The pilot's response came back, cool and professional despite the crisis. "Then we do what bombers do. We keep flying. We keep moving toward England. We don't give up." Jimmy's gun barked out its last sustained burst. The rounds went downrange with all the remaining authority the weapon could muster, and they caught the 5th fighter directly in the canopy. The pilot's head came back slightly from the impact, and the fighter rolled inverted suddenly as the pilot lost consciousness. The aircraft fell from the sky without ever firing another shot. That left 4 fighters, and Jimmy was out of ammunition. He looked at his ammunition belts. Empty. Completely empty. The last rounds had been fired, and the gun was now silent for the second time in the engagement. This time, there would be no clearing a jam that could bring it back to life. This time, the silence was permanent. The 4 remaining German fighters regrouped and prepared for a final coordinated assault. This time, there would be no defensive fire to stop them. This time, they would be attacking an unarmed target. The pilot reached for the intercom. "All defensive personnel, we're out of ammunition. Prepare for crash procedures. I'm going to try to get us low enough that—" But he didn't finish the sentence because something happened that nobody had anticipated. Something that would change the entire trajectory of the engagement. Jimmy's gun exploded. Not a small explosion. Not a contained failure. A catastrophic mechanical failure where the barrel, heated far beyond its design specifications and finally pushed to the breaking point, simply fractured along its entire length. The receiver assembly warped suddenly, the bolts seized, and the entire mechanism became a twisted piece of scrap metal that could never fire again. Kaufman's modification, the stupid idea that had somehow turned a 19-year-old gunner into a fighter slayer, had finally given up the ghost. The gun's destruction was actually visible from the outside of the aircraft. A puff of smoke and flame came from the top turret as the internal stress finally exceeded the structural integrity of the metal. For a moment, Jimmy thought his entire turret was going to explode. He threw his hands over his face, bracing for impact, expecting the fragmentation to tear through his body. But the designers of the .50 caliber turret had understood that mechanical failure was always possible, and they'd built in safeguards. The barrel shattered, but the fragments were contained within the assembly. The receiver cracked, but it didn't fragment outward. The gun died, but it died quietly compared to how catastrophically the system had failed. Jimmy sat in the wreckage of his weapon and did something he hadn't done in hours. He cried. Not from fear, not from pain, but from the release of 3 hours of continuous adrenaline and stress, finally reaching the breaking point and demanding outlet. Below, the 4 German fighters were confused. They'd been expecting to see continued fire from the top turret, and they'd planned their attack based on the assumption that there would be defensive fire to work around. Seeing the turret suddenly go silent, and seeing the puff of smoke that indicated mechanical failure, they realized they were about to get an easy kill. The lead fighter came in from above and began his final attack run, but Donnie Hughes, in the tail turret, was still functional. The tail gun roared to life, and the lead fighter suddenly realized he was under fire from an unexpected angle. He broke hard left, and his cannon fire missed the nose section by a good 30 feet. The second fighter, seeing the first one struggling against concentrated tail fire, decided to press his attack from a different angle. Ray Mitchell in the waist got a lock on him and fired. His rounds caught the fighter's left wing, and the pilot suddenly decided that easy prey wasn't worth dying for. He broke off and started to retreat. The third fighter tried a different approach, coming directly at the nose of the aircraft, where no defensive fire could reach him without exposing gunners to impossible angles. The co-pilot, manning the nose gun, fired at point-blank range. The fighter's canopy shattered, and the pilot's body jerked back from the impacts. The Bf-109 rolled hard to the right, completely out of control, and spiraled downward toward the water below. That left one fighter. The pilot was young, maybe 20, maybe even younger, and he was seeing his comrades get picked off by an aircraft that shouldn't be able to defend itself. He made a decision that brave pilots sometimes make. He decided to avenge his fallen comrades. He came in hard, pressing his attack despite knowing that defensive fire was still capable of killing him. His cannon fire raked across the bomber's fuselage, hitting the right wing and the tail section. Something in the bomber's structure screamed, an actual sound of metal being ripped apart. The aircraft lurched hard to the left, and suddenly the pilot was fighting the controls. Ray Mitchell, furious at seeing his bomber torn up by this final attack, fired everything he had left. His rounds caught the Bf-109 squarely in the fuselage, and the pilot suddenly arched back in his seat from the impacts. The fighter rolled inverted and started falling toward the water below. But before it fell completely, the pilot managed to eject. His parachute opened and he descended slowly toward the sea. The engagement was over. The bomber was still flying, but barely. The pilot assessed the damage and quickly came to the realization that they were in serious trouble. Hydraulic pressure is critical. Right engine is starting to overheat. I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this aircraft in the air. But they were only 15 minutes away from the English coast. 15 minutes. He pushed the throttles forward, trying to get every last ounce of speed from the remaining 3 engines. The left engine, which had been smoking for the last hour, coughed and spat, but it kept turning. The right engine, which was now overheating, also kept turning despite the temperature warning light that was glowing a sullen red. Jimmy climbed down from his turret for the first time in over 3 hours. His legs barely worked. He had to hold onto the ladder supports just to prevent himself from falling. His entire body was shaking, whether from cold or shock, or the aftermath of adrenaline, he couldn't tell. Ray Mitchell was waiting at the bottom of the ladder. He gripped Jimmy's shoulder and didn't say anything. Sometimes there was nothing to say. You just acknowledged that the other person had done something extraordinary and left it at that. The bombardier in the nose was in serious condition. The medtech had bandaged him as well as he could, but there was no way to tell if the wounds were fatal or not until they got back to a hospital. The ball turret gunner was also injured, bleeding from multiple wounds sustained during the earlier attack. But he was conscious, he was alive. They were all alive, which seemed impossible given the level of combat they'd just survived. The radio operator was trying to raise air traffic control in England, trying to figure out if they had a chance of making it to an airfield. The response came back, scratchy and welcome. Roger, bomber formation. We have you on radar. Recommend heading toward Thorpe Abbotts. Runway 3 is clear for emergency landing. The pilot didn't need to be told twice. Thorpe Abbotts was an American air base, close enough that even with 2 damaged engines, they had a chance of making it. The English coast appeared through the clouds, and suddenly there was land beneath them instead of hostile airspace. The tension in the cockpit relaxed slightly. They'd made it. Against odds that should have been absolutely impossible, they'd made it. But as they descended toward Thorpe Abbotts, the right engine finally gave up the ghost. It seized completely, and the propeller stopped spinning. The pilot immediately feathered the engine and switched to manual hydraulic backup, knowing that they now had one good engine, one marginal engine, and an aircraft that was rapidly becoming harder to control. The landing was going to be brutal. The approach to Thorpe Abbotts was tense and methodical. The pilot was making constant small adjustments, fighting the aircraft's tendency to slip right due to the dead engine. The co-pilot was calling out altitude and approach angle. The bombardier, despite his injuries, was assisting with whatever he could manage from the nose position. And down in the waist section, Ray Mitchell was looking out at the right wing and seeing the damage that hadn't been visible from inside. Holes you could see sky through, twisted metal, structural damage that made the wing look like it might just decide to fall off at any moment. The airfield appeared ahead, the runway stretching out like a ribbon of safety. The pilot began his descent, bringing the aircraft down in a gentle glide that would have been perfect if only the aircraft weren't so damaged, so heavy, so marginal in its flight characteristics. The landing gear came down, and this was a moment of absolute terror because there was no guarantee that the damaged hydraulic system would actually lock the gear in place. Lights blinked green. Gear locked. Everything was functioning well enough to get them on the ground. The wheels touched the tarmac and the pilot hit the brakes. The B-17 squealed and lurched, bleeding off speed. For a moment it seemed like they might just make it. They might just roll to a gentle stop, and everyone could walk away from this, and this would become one of those legendary stories that gets told and retold in officers' clubs for years. That's when the right wheel, damaged from cannon fire earlier in the engagement, collapsed. The landing gear buckled, and suddenly the right wing was scraping the tarmac. Sparks flew from the contact point, and the entire aircraft lurched hard to the right. The pilot was fighting the controls, trying to keep the aircraft from flipping, trying to slow their forward momentum without capsizing. The nose gear suddenly snapped, and suddenly they were sliding sideways down the runway, the fuselage grinding against the concrete. The fire trucks were already rolling. They'd been ready for an emergency landing, and now they had one. The pilot cut all the engines. There was no point trying to slow them with the remaining engines when the aircraft was already nearly stopped. They skidded for another 100 yards, and then finally came to rest, smoking and shattered but still in one piece. For a moment, there was silence. Complete, absolute silence. Jimmy realized he was holding his breath and let it out in one long, shaking exhale. "All personnel prepare to evacuate," came the pilot's voice through the intercom. "Move quickly but in an organized manner. We don't know if this aircraft is stable. Move to the exits." The bombardier had to be helped to the right exit by the med tech. The ball turret gunner limped out with assistance. Ray Mitchell moved through the waist section, counting heads, making sure everyone was accounted for, making sure nobody was left behind. Jimmy pushed himself up from his position by the waist window and made his way aft toward the rear exit. His legs were shaky, barely responding to his commands. He had to use the fuselage supports to pull himself along. By the time he reached the exit, emergency personnel were already climbing up to provide assistance. He was helped down to the tarmac, and the first thing that hit him was the cold air and the realization that he was alive. Actually alive. Not in any kind of abstract sense, but in the concrete, immediate sense of feet touching solid ground, and lungs breathing air that wasn't mixed with jet fuel and cordite. The pilot emerged from the cockpit and made his way to the exit, moving carefully down the ladder with professional composure. Once he reached the tarmac, his composure cracked slightly, and he visibly sagged with the weight of what they'd just survived. An officer approached them, a major with alert eyes who was clearly in charge of the emergency response. "I'm Major Patterson. I was monitoring your approach. Your radio operator reported some unusual activity involving your defensive armament." He looked directly at Jimmy. "I need to know exactly what happened up there." Jimmy opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. How could he possibly explain what had happened? How could he tell this officer that he'd shot down 9 German fighters with a gun that had been modified in ways that violated every standard of ordnance safety? How could he explain that he'd fired at rates that shouldn't have been possible, with ammunition that had lasted longer than ammunition should last, using a system that was never supposed to work at all? "Sir," Jimmy finally managed, "the gun worked really well today." The major looked at him for a long moment. 9 confirmed kills. I got the report from your radio operator. 9 BF-109s shot down by a single gunner. That's exceptional. He paused. That's also impossible. One man doesn't shoot down 9 fighters with a standard .50 caliber turret. Jimmy didn't say anything. He just looked at the smoking ruin of what had been the B-17 that had brought him and his crew home. I'm going to need a full report, the major continued. Every detail about how that gun was operating, what ammunition configuration you were using, everything. He signaled to an aide. Get this man to medical and then to debrief. And find whoever was responsible for maintaining that turret's weaponry. I need to talk to them immediately. As medics began moving him toward the aid station, Jimmy caught sight of the B-17 from an angle that let him see the top turret. The damage was extensive. The barrel was twisted beyond recognition. The receiver was blackened from heat. The entire mechanism looked like it had been through some kind of apocalyptic furnace, which it had. And somewhere back in England, Eddie Kaufman was about to have a very interesting conversation with military intelligence about exactly what kind of modification he'd made to that turret's ammunition feed system. The debriefing took place in a facility that looked like it had been designed for the express purpose of making people uncomfortable. Strip lighting, metal chairs, the smell of cigarettes and institutional coffee. Jimmy sat across from an intelligence officer, a captain named Morrison, who had the kind of exhausted eyes that suggested he'd spent the war asking difficult questions and not getting good answers. I need you to understand that what you're telling me is literally impossible, Morrison said, tapping his pen against his clipboard. 9 confirmed kills by a single gunner in one engagement. That's beyond any standard performance metric. And according to your ammunition count, you shouldn't have had the ammunition reserves to achieve that level of firing output. The numbers don't add up. Jimmy had thought carefully about what he would say and what he wouldn't. He understood that admitting that the turret had been modified might get Eddie Kaufman into serious trouble. But the modification had also saved his life and the lives of 9 other men. So he decided to tell the truth, because the truth was all he had. There was a modification, Jimmy said carefully, to the ammunition feed mechanism. Someone, a private named Kaufman, thought he could improve the linking efficiency, make the ammunition travel through the system faster, which would increase the firing rate. Morrison's pen stopped moving. And did this modification work? Yes, sir. It did. The firing rate increased significantly. By how much? Jimmy calculated. Maybe 40 to 50% higher than normal. The gun was running at rates I've never experienced before. Rounds came out like a continuous stream instead of individual shots. He paused. But it also generated tremendous heat. The barrel nearly warped. The receiver assembly was charring. I'm surprised the gun even lasted as long as it did. Morrison made notes. This Kaufman, do you know where he is? No, sir. I haven't seen him since he installed the modification. Well, I'll have to track him down, Morrison said. He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying Jimmy carefully. What you're describing, a firearms modification that increases cyclic rate by that magnitude, that's not just against regulations. That's actively dangerous. Barrels can warp. Receivers can crack. You could have been seriously injured, possibly killed if that gun had failed catastrophically. Yes, sir, I understand that, Jimmy said quietly. And yet you kept firing, even after you realized the gun was failing. Even after you could feel the heat build up and the mechanical stress, you kept pressing until the barrel basically self-destructed. The formation was under attack, sir. My crew needed defensive fire. Morrison nodded slowly. I know. That's why you're here and not sitting in a brig facing charges for allowing unauthorized modifications to military equipment. He tapped his pen against his clipboard again. The fact that you chose to prioritize crew safety over equipment integrity, that shows good judgment. But it also shows how desperate the tactical situation must have been. Over the next hour, Morrison extracted every detail from Jimmy. The engagement patterns of the German fighters, the points during the engagement when he'd felt the gun was about to fail, the precise moment when the barrel had finally given up. Morrison took meticulous notes, clearly building a comprehensive picture of what had occurred. When the debriefing was finished, Morrison walked Jimmy to the door. That bombardier in your nose section, the one who got hit, is going to make it, by the way. The wounds looked worse than they were. Another few inches to either side and it would have been fatal. Your entire crew got very, very lucky today. Yes, sir, Jimmy agreed. And you should know that 5 of those 9 kills have been independently confirmed by other crew members in the formation. The bomber escort fighters saw the last two engagements. They're reporting that your defensive fire was exceptional. One of the fighter pilots said it looked like you had a twin-mount heavy machine gun up there instead of a single turret. Direct quote. Jimmy didn't know what to say to that. A few days later, Morrison brought Eddie Kaufman into a small office and closed the door. Kaufman was nervous. Incredibly nervous, the kind of nervous that came from knowing that you'd violated protocols and weren't sure what the consequences might be. Your modification worked, Morrison said without preamble. The 50 caliber turret aboard B-17 23C shot down 9 enemy fighters using your modified ammunition feed system. That's 9 confirmed kills attributed directly to your engineering work. Kaufman's expression went from nervous to shocked. It worked. Actually worked. It worked. It also nearly destroyed itself in the process and came remarkably close to causing serious injury to your crew member. But the fact remains that you engineered a solution to a problem, and that solution achieved extraordinary results. Morrison leaned back in his chair, which means I have a decision to make about whether to prosecute you for unauthorized modification of military equipment or to recommend you for commendation. Kaufman swallowed hard. I'm going with option 2, Morrison continued. But there are conditions. First, you're going to document exactly what you did and how you did it. Every step of the modification process, every calculation you made, every assumption you built the system on. Second, I'm forwarding your work to the Army Air Force's Technical Command, and they're going to evaluate whether this modification could be implemented on other aircraft systems. And third, if anyone ever asks you about this, you tell them that all modifications were conducted under orders from the ordnance officer. Kaufman nodded quickly. Absolutely, sir. No problem. The reason I'm doing this, Morrison said, is that innovation is what wins wars, not bureaucratic adherence to standards. Someone with brains and drive came up with a solution, tested it, and proved it could work. In any sane military organization, that would result in commendation, not court-martial. Back at the airbase, Jimmy was given 2 weeks of leave while his bomber was being repaired. The damage assessment showed that the aircraft was salvageable, but would require extensive reconstruction. New engines, replacement fuselage sections, complete rework of the hydraulic system. She wouldn't be flying again for at least 2 months. Jimmy used his leave to travel to London, to walk through streets that had been rebuilt after German bombing runs, to sit in pubs and drink beer that tasted worse than anything he'd ever experienced. He tried to process what had happened. 3 hours of continuous combat, 9 kills, a gun that had nearly melted down from the intensity of operation. Every night he'd wake up in his hotel room, and for a few seconds before consciousness fully kicked in, he'd be back in the turret. He'd feel the heat. He'd hear the roar of the 50 caliber guns. He'd smell the cordite and hot metal, and then reality would reassert itself, and he'd realize he was alive, in England, safe. On his final night of leave, Jimmy sat in a quiet pub and ordered whiskey instead of beer. The bartender, an older man who'd seen too many young soldiers come and go, didn't comment. He just poured the drink and moved on. Jimmy thought about the 5 squadrons of Bf-109s that his gun had helped send out of the sky. He thought about the pilots who'd been in those fighters, men who were trained killers, but who were also someone's sons, someone's brothers, someone's boyfriends. He thought about the fact that in a different war, in a different world, he might have been fighting on the opposite side. But this wasn't a different world. This was the world where Eddie Kaufman had made a stupid modification that somehow worked. This was the world where a 19-year-old boy with shaking hands had sat in a frozen turret at 28,000 feet and fought off 9 enemy aircraft. This was the world where luck and skill and desperation had combined to produce a result that military historians would study and puzzle over for years to come. The modification to Kaufman's ammunition feed system was never mass-produced. The technical command evaluated it, appreciated the ingenuity, but ultimately decided that the heat stress on the weapons made it impractical for sustained use. But the reports about what a single gunner had achieved on November 17, 1943, over the English Channel, spread through the Army Air Forces like a particular kind of legend. Other gunners wanted to know what made that turret special. Other ordnance men wanted to understand exactly what Kaufman had done, and for a brief period, there was genuine interest in whether a man with enough courage and enough ammunition could actually hold the line against overwhelming odds. The answer, it turned out, was yes. But the cost was a gun that had been pushed so far beyond its design specifications that it had essentially committed mechanical suicide. The barrel had been warped beyond repair. The receiver assembly had been damaged so extensively that it couldn't be salvaged. The entire turret assembly had to be replaced, and Jimmy Corbett, 19 years old, became one of the most decorated gunners in the 8th Air Force. But he never talked about it much. He just did his job, flew his missions, and tried to survive long enough to make it home. In the end, that's all any of them could hope for: survival. And if luck, skill, and a stupid engineering modification could help buy a little bit more survival, then maybe it was worth the heat, the fear, and the very real chance that the whole system could have killed him. Maybe that was what war really was. Not glory or honor or any of the things they told you in propaganda films. It was about stupid ideas that somehow worked. It was about desperation and ingenuity, combining in ways that nobody could have predicted. It was about a 19-year-old kid in a frozen turret saying yes to a chance to matter, even if that chance came with a 50-50 probability of death. And in the final analysis, he'd chosen correctly. If you found this story gripping, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a like, subscribe for more untold war stories, and let me know in the comments, what's the most incredible piece of military history you've ever learned about? Tell us your story.